Everybody still all right? Good to see. Okay, now here we've got some examples of exempt supplies. Rail, LRT, bus, local taxi, toll. So toll highway, when you go through, no GST when you pay the toll. Passenger transport by water. Land for general use, okay, so it's not commercial land. If it's residential land or general use, exempt. Private healthcare and education. Residential property. And financial services. Financial services are exempt in just about every country of the world. Very hard to work out how to tax them, so they don't. All right, so governments of each country pick things to put in this particular square here. All right, so in Australia, probably half of those are in the exempt square, not all of them. So the government chooses which ones they think they can manage in this particular square, because there's no GST on the output, but you can't claim the input tax credits. All right, so that's the exempt supplies. Now, out-of-scope supplies. Typically, when we're advising our clients, we will be telling them that you will get people who will not register for GST because they do not reach the threshold, and customs, even if you ask, will not register you under the threshold. You can ask them, it is up to them whether they register you or not. So they will be non-registered persons. Their supply is out of scope. They cannot charge GST, they cannot claim any GST back. If it's not in course or furtherance of your business, so if it's a private pursuit, it's out of scope. Okay, so you could actually be doing something in your business which is subject to GST, but as a private individual, that won't necessarily be caught by the GST legislation. Okay, probably one that you will see, and it's certainly the same in Australia, majority of supplies made by federal, state and local authorities are considered out of scope, so they're not required or not allowed to charge GST on the supplies they make, which are of a regulatory nature. In Australia, if you were a business and you're required to get a licence to operate, for example, as a restaurant from the state government or the local government, they would charge you a fee which would have no GST in it. They're not allowed to claim to charge you GST. So from a business perspective, when you're looking at your inputs, you cannot claim an input tax credit where you've never been charged GST. So it is important to differentiate those supplies, those inputs, so that you don't claim the wrong thing. Okay, because we'll come to the penalty clauses soon. Yes, here we are. Surprising. Okay, now, the rules in Australia aren't quite as tough as they're proposed to be in Malaysia. These are very tough rules. Okay, so you're late with your registration, we'll penalise you. Okay? If you make an offence which isn't specifically covered in the GST legislation, it's a fine up to 30,000 ringgit and or 2 years jail. Okay? Now, this is the one that most people should be very wary of, an incorrect return. So when I was talking about before, I add up all my inputs, I added all my outputs. The difference between the two is what I'm sending to Royal Malaysian Customs. If you do not claim the input tax credits on all your purchases, they won't really care. All right? If you fail to include output tax in your return, they will really care. All right? This is where this penalty will come in. So if you make a mistake in your return, so you understate what you owe them, you can be fined up to 50,000 ringgit and or 3 years jail. Now, if you make this mistake every month for 12 months, multiply by 12. So 600,000 ringgit and 36 years jail. Okay? So the idea is, don't make a mistake. All right? But everybody makes mistakes. It's as simple as that. What you've got to be able to do is show that you have taken due care when you've gone through and prepared your return. All right? If they come and visit you and say, okay, well, you've made a mistake, we want the tax you should have paid, and we're going to penalise you some amount, all right, because it's up to these amounts, then you need to ensure that you don't make that mistake again. I can tell you, in Australia, They are kind and generous the first time. After that, they aren't. All right? In Australia, for the first 2 years, the revenue authorities would come out, oh, you made a mistake, okay, give us the money, don't do it again. All right? After that, you made a mistake, okay, give us the money, 40% penalty, we'll give you an interest charge, and if you do this again, we'll be back to live at your business premises. All right, what you need to avoid is the revenue authorities finding you popular. Okay, if you make mistakes and repeat mistakes, they will return because they know you are a ready revenue source. Okay, you do not need that flag on your file. Now, evasion and fraud, 40 times the tax and or imprisonment not exceeding 7 years or both. In Australia, this is probably the one that gets the most press. Jeff O'Connell Proprietary Limited has defrauded the Australian Taxation Office and claimed 400,000 Australian dollars in refunds from the tax office. He has now been jailed for 7 years and asked and told to repay the amount. All right, the tax office loves publishing those things. They will, in Australia, penalise you and hopefully, from their perspective, jail you. Okay, I'd suggest here they'll be just as enthusiastic with that last one there. All right, so those that think that GST is an easy mark for making money, be warned that unfortunately it isn't quite as easy as you think. Okay, so they will do this, and the way that the audit program here is set up, it is years ahead of Australia, years ahead of any country in the world. If they get their audit program right, they will know everything about your business. They'll know who you bought from, what you bought, when you bought it, how much you paid for it. Okay, so it is comprehensive. Do not make a deliberate mistake. Everybody makes honest errors. Okay? Now, who might end up in jail? Well, basically anyone. Okay? So everybody usually thinks, oh, it's the directors of a company that will go to jail. Well, no. Customs and the Malaysian government have given everybody the opportunity to be treated fairly. So everybody has the opportunity to go to jail. Okay? When I was a in-house tax resource at a company, myself and my offsider used to do the GST return every month. And there's a declaration on it which says, I certify that this is true and correct. We always used to fight between each other as to who ticked that little box, because if that's wrong, I'm the person they're coming to see, okay? So if you're the person in a company who does the tax returns, the GST return, you'll be the first person asked, all right? So you need to understand how the system works, how your business is impacted by GST, and to be able to explain that. As I said, an honest error is acceptable. Everybody will make them, okay? So you can get out of this, but you've got to prove that you didn't know anything about it and you had taken all these steps to make sure it wouldn't happen. So I think the getting out of the penalty is pretty hard to work out. Okay, what's benefits and safeguards? Now, one of the benefits is, and certainly was in Australia, is that there are now expected to be 300,000 businesses reporting data to the revenue authorities. Under sales and services tax, it's about 60-odd thousand, according to Malaysian customs figures. All right, so there's more people in the net, there's more information going around. If I'm providing services to you, you want a tax invoice off me. Okay, that is your prime source document. Customs looks for tax invoices. So they might go to see you, your business, but what they're looking for is me. They go through your transactions and they say, well, they've spent 600,000 ringgit with Jeff this year and he's not on our register as a GST registered taxpayer. I think we'll go visit Jeff. All right, so they're not necessarily looking at you. They might want to find out about someone else, but this is the amount of information that they have. They can find out virtually anything. All right? It's self-policing because you want the tax invoice. All right? So we're both pushing each other to get a document to prove what's happened with this transaction. Now, lower income tax rates. I did see something announced in the budget that the income tax rates are being changed. Typically, that happens with all governments, drop the rates of income tax because you need, in some cases, more disposable income to pay for what you have to purchase with GST if you're the end consumer. Not to worry so much the business, but the end consumer. Now, the last one there, lower cost to business. I'd suggest over time that's probably correct because of the reporting you have to do, because the returns are monthly if you're over 5 million ringgit a year, or quarterly if you're under that. So most people, and my income tax colleagues who I talk to, they see people once a year and muck around with some figures and produce an income tax return. GST purposes, most people will be doing it monthly, and most people, the rest of them will be doing it quarterly. So you'll have a very good idea of how your business is going. But initially, there will be some teething problems, particularly from an IT perspective, all right? If you've got a voluminous transactions and you haven't got a good IT system, you will never manage GST manually, right? You need a computer system that works and will do most of the hard yards for you, right? It needs to be able to process all these things. Okay, now, the GST audit file is the information source I was talking about before. Customs have recommended that businesses be able to produce this document. It is a document which provides them with data on everything you've done. Now, it is only recommended, it's not mandatory, it's not by law, you do not have to produce it. I'd recommend that if you can't produce it, Customs will be visiting you for a lot longer than you initially thought, all right? So it's probably to your advantage. Now, I'll quickly go through this because this one's a little bit out of my league. Price control. Certainly the Malaysian government implemented some changes in their anti-profiteering legislation to target companies who tried to take advantage of GST. And I'll show you some figures in a minute from Australia on what they did in Australia to people who tried to take advantage of the general public. It is to be seen as to how proactive they are and what they target. If they've got a number of officers and a plan, I understand they've got some information from the Australian authorities, which is the ACCC, on how they did the process when GST came in Australia. So if they've got that background, they should know what's happening. All right, now, usually the source of information for the authorities, which will be the Ministry of Domestic Finance or something, I don't think it is here, is the general public. In Australia, the general public rang up and said, I've just been to Jeff's store, he's put his prices up by this, can you find out what he's up to? And that's exactly what they did. They went round and saw a person and asked them to justify how you've increased your prices. You should be analysing what GST will do to you from your own personal perspective. Okay, from my business perspective, I am making this margin now. After GST, I want to maintain my margin. That does two things. That tells you how your business is going and how it will be going, and then it says, okay, I can justify this if the authorities come in to see me. Okay, now these are a few things here for the general business community. In our discussions with our clients, what we always say is that we will never understand your business as well as you do. We can give you insights into how the GST will impact on your business, on particular business sectors, but you need to be able to understand it. We will teach you about GST, but you need to be the one that is personally involved in administering it in your business. Registration, I mentioned, make sure you register before it's time for a penalty to apply. The tax invoice, debit note, credit note. Debit note and credit note in Malaysia seem to be interchangeable with invoice. Going forward for GST, that will not be allowed by the authorities. All right, you issue a tax invoice. If you want to change that tax invoice, you issue a credit note or a debit note. The debit note or the credit note is not the originating document. Okay?